Professor B.F. Skinner, one of the leading behavioral psychologists in the world today, author of Science and Human Behavior, a novel, Walden 2, the list goes on and on. And the occasion for our meeting is really to discover where Skinner stands at this point on the question of democracy and the possibilities for a science of human behavior, given the general malaise in our society today. Now I'll simply sit back and let you talk.
Well, that's a rather an embarrassing start. I don't know where I stand on democracy. When I wrote Walden 2, my protagonist is clearly undemocratic.
This was 1948, wasn't it?
I wrote it in 45, right after the war. In fact, the war was just coming to an end. And there are things in there that, at the time I wrote the book, I should not have subscribed to. That's a nice thing to have a character who will say things that you're not quite ready to say. And I let Fraser go. He really says such things as the chances of influencing a national election are much less than the chance that you'll be killed on the way to the polls, and so on, that kind of thing. Yeah. I don't know whether I've convinced myself, though, about this. I think perhaps I'm a better Fraserian now than when I wrote the book. I recently looked at the German translation of Walden 2, and I must say that seeing those sentences in German made it even worse.
Well, the German probably endows them with a great deal of intensity that you didn't want to convey in the first place.
Yes, and it also it makes it seem like a criticism from without, whereas I thought I was criticizing the system clearly from within. I do think that we are in serious trouble so far as democratic theory goes. I think the old line liberal, the liberal of the 19th century particularly, just isn't functioning today. He's a sort of Don Quixote. He's fighting a battle which belongs in a war that's past now, and he's defending things he doesn't believe in. He's in a very serious situation.
But who knows better what the direction of American society should be? I think probably most people would agree that back in the early 30s, when liberals were in the cockpit and in the driver's seat, they at least had a direction or a sense of direction, a sense of momentum. Who is their counterpart today, do you think?
Well, I don't think there is a counterpart. I think that's one of the problems. We've not found out what sort of position will work, especially at the present time. And let me say very quickly that I have not the solution to this at all. I don't even try to tackle the current problems in world affairs. My alibi for that is a sort of analogy with nuclear physics. When they first went to Roosevelt and said, here's the possibility of a fantastic bomb that will end the war in no time at all, Roosevelt couldn't say, all right, go ahead and build it. They couldn't say, we know how to build it. All they could say is, we know how to find out how to build it. And I think that the only feasible attitude today is we can always go on coming out with political programs and trying them out as we've done in the past. But the only honest, and it seems to me also the only feasible attitude that one can take toward human affairs today is to say, all right, we haven't the solutions now, but we must bear down hard on finding out how to find them.
Of course, a major question, I think, here has to do with the extent to which it's plausible to regard you as a scientist. If one thinks of science and the consequences of science as per se non-ethical, see, and I'm leading or following your lead here with the atomic bomb and so on. Is it appropriate to regard Skinner as a scientist?
Well, certainly not as a nuclear scientist, but that, I think, is a mistake people make. Everyone says that science and technology have got us into trouble. And they have, medical science. Well, what do we have now? An expanding population we can't control. Industry and the affluent culture and pollution, and so science and technology have done wonders, and they've also caused a great deal of trouble. And then one said, well, but you see, technology can't get us out of the trouble that it has got us into. But we're not. That isn't the right technology. The problems today are not to be solved with more physical or biological technology. You can't solve the problem of population by inventing better contraceptive devices. The problem is to get people to use them and to limit the sizes of their families and stop having unwanted children. You can't change pollution by changing the kinds of detergents people are using. There's an enormous change which we needed to persuade people to live in non-polluting ways.
You're talking
all
about
the traffic
human
jam
engineering.
on Sunday afternoon, maybe the thing we have to give up. You see, that's a behavioral problem.
Yes.
It's not one on the amount of smoke that comes out of a car. Technology can help, but it can't solve the major problem. War, you know, you can build better ABM systems, and then someone builds a better missile, and you build a better ABM system, and you build a better missile. But that will never lead to peace. It might lead to some kind of a safe stalemate, but that's the best you can hope for. If you want to solve the problem of war, you've got to start doing something about human behavior. And we need the science and the technology that can do that, which would be as powerful as physical and biological technology now are.
And yet there's enormous resistance, and nobody knows this better than you, to the sort of human engineering you're speaking of.
Here we have a spaceship going to the moon, and they change the direction just the right amount to get it to go around and so on. And then that certainly is as complicated a problem as building better living space for cities, for example. But that latter involves so much of human behavior, whereas the former involves very little, that we give up. And then we say, well, you see, we're stuck. Technology won't do it. Now, you ask me whether I regard myself as a scientist. I really wear two hats, and I think one of them is a scientific hat. The laboratory research on which I spent 35 years of my life. I no longer have a laboratory. I'm
kept,
relaxing.
Company with pigeons and rats.
Rats,
primarily.
but many different species have been in, and it's being done now with human subjects too. This, I think, is a genuine scientific advance. I think we can get reproducible results, precise results, and what it really, the thing that pleases me about it is that it is directly applicable to problems in daily life. Much psychological research is couched in such terms that you can't really apply it, but the kind of thing that we do in the laboratory emphasizes observable and manipulable things, and hence a technology flows from it very rapidly. And I think we are beginning to have a very powerful technology of behavior, but certainly not powerful enough for me to go down to Washington and straighten out the administration.
Not quite yet.
No, not yet.
Till next week or the week after.
No.
Now that's one hat. Skinner, the scientist in the laboratory, with the Skinner box and stimulus response and so on. The other hat.
Well, the other hat is the other thing I'm doing now, talking about the implications of this for human affairs, to the extent to which we are in a position to examine our ways of thinking about people, society, and to see whether there aren't better ways. So that I'm an amateur sociologist, an amateur anthropologist, I suppose, but I think I bring something to those fields which throws a little fresh light on them. And,
you don't think of this as just a kind of dilettante's hunting license, then?
Well, I'm amazed that you use that expression, because I once told Clyde Cluckhorn, and I was going to look into the design of a culture. He said that. He said, have you got your hunting license? What he meant was, have you got a PhD in anthropology? And I haven't, but that doesn't worry me particularly. No, I have always been very much interested in human behavior in real life. I shouldn't have studied rats and pigeons because I love them at all. I don't. In fact, I'm allergic to pigeons, and I don't like rats at all, but I found them very useful at one time.
Do you think that the kinds of inferences for human behavior that you drew and have drawn through the years from the behavior of rats and pigeons and so on have been validated by and large? Because these researches go back over decades.
Oh, yes. Well, the actual, what we call the experimental analysis of behavior has now been going on for 40 years, actually. I think it's been not only validated, but improved and sharpened tremendously over those years. When I go back and look at the curves I used to get in my crude apparatus, curves which were so smooth then that people thought I faked them. I'm really somebody that was suggested.
You've always been suspect,
they would now be regarded as very crude and very irregular. We get very much smoother curves today. I'm happy about the development of the laboratory science. I'm not at all worried about whether it extrapolates from one species to another. That isn't really an important question.
Why not? Let me ask the layman's question quite genuinely. Why not?
Yeah. Well, when you make allowances for the conspicuous differences between species, then you isolate something which is common to all of them. For example, if you want to use stimuli, you use stimuli the species can respond to. You don't use color if the species is colorblind. You don't use high pitches if the ear of the species can't hear them, and so on. You choose some behavior which is within range. You don't have a horse picking up something with his hoof. You don't have a pigeon using hands. You don't have a monkey pecking with his nose, and so on. You find behaviors which are appropriate to the overall structure of the species. Then when it comes to what we call reinforcers, rewards, you use things which are appropriate again. I wouldn't try to reinforce a horse with the dog meat that I would reinforce a dog with, and so on. So after all, you eliminate the differences in the receptors and in the motor responses, in deprivations which we use to improve reinforcement and so on. When you've done all of that, you get to behavioral processes that are remarkably similar. I can show you curves from rats, pigeons, monkeys, psychotic human beings, human children, adult human subjects, which show very similar characteristics. And if you take a bit of nerve tissue, if you like to think of in terms of the brain, take a bit of nerve tissue from those species, that's very similar too, you see. There's a very great difference in the overall gross structure, but the fundamental thing there is working in the same way. Now, what is so unusual about man? Well, it isn't that he has any kind of different behavioral process. It's that he has an enormously big storage system. He can acquire a fantastic repertoire of behavior without getting it all mixed up. You couldn't begin to teach a pigeon a number of different things a child can learn in one day. And
yet you've had remarkable success in teaching pigeons.
Oh, we can arrange extremely complex conditions to which pigeons will respond in ways which, if they were human, we would say, well, that's higher mental process or something of that kind. Now, the human is distinguished by his capacity to accumulate an enormous repertoire of behavior, or what you might call experience, and to store it for long periods of time, and of course then his verbal behavior, and that is a great step forward.
Well, now, in thinking over the kinds of advances your name is associated with, I wonder where you place yourself, in what tradition. I think we should really, as it were, lay this to rest, because there are many people who would trace a line of descent from Pavlov and his dog salivating down through Watson in the 20s and 30s, and then to Skinner today. Is this a decent line of descent?
I think it's a perfectly reasonable line, but it has been descent. It's not been fixation at a stage.
Or is it ascent?
I would say it began with Darwin, and from Darwin on, through those people who were trying to do what Darwin wanted, which was to establish similarities between man and the animals by showing that animals were human. And then the skepticism of the behaviorist and John B. Watson, and before him an English biologist, Lloyd Morgan, that really you don't need to assume human abilities in order to explain animal behavior. Then the final step, you don't need to assume them to explain human behavior either, you say. Now, Pavlov was an offshoot. He was not in that tradition of Darwin, Morgan, and then on through into American functional psychology. But of course, he was very important. He was very important to me. I ran on to Pavlov's book just after I got out of college and had an enormous influence on me. Too much, I suppose. It took me a long while to realize what it really was and to get rid of some of its features. I also was very much influenced by John Watson, mainly through Bertrand Russell, who took Watson very seriously at that time. But by the middle 30s, and that was 8 or 10 years after I looked at this at all, I was already working away from it. And what we now do in analyzing behavior is very far from the old stimulus-response model. I don't regard behavior as a response to stimuli. That's absurd.
Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I've had a number of conversations, some televised, with Carl Rogers.
Oh, yeah.
And all of the kind of thing that Rogers is associated with, which is very voguish today, would seem to be antithetical to the purposes of Skinner and the behaviorists.
Oh, it is antithetical. There is a split today, and it's a very sharp one, very, very easily marked, between those who still want to explain behavior in terms of something going on inside, in the inner man, the autonomous man, who starts things, who is a creator, an originator, and those who look beyond the person to his earlier history and his genetic endowment for explanations. And my complaint with people who go only back inside without going on through and finding out what caused the things inside is that they leave us completely helpless because the things inside can't be reached. You can't change them. There's nothing you can do about them. Freud, of course, is the figure here rather than Rogers or Maslow and those people. He emphasized the way people feel about things and the great mental apparatus, all the stuff that was churning up inside a person.
Mental and emotional.
And emotional, oh yes, feelings, ideas, purposes. We deal with these things now, not in terms of something which the inner man originates, but in terms of the earlier history of the organism, human or otherwise. And the great advantage there is that when you get outside, you can see what you're talking about. And of course, Freud had to do that too. I mean, he would say, well, here's a man who's not able to carry on his business because he's suffering from anxiety. Well, all right, but where's the anxiety come from? Oh, well, when he was a child, his father whipped him for hitting his brother or something like that. Sibling rivalry led to anxiety. Anxiety leads to disturbances in his relationship with his fellow men. Well, what's that middle term doing in there? Is it really true that anxiety causes behavior? Well, that raises a metaphysical problem. How can a feeling, a mental feeling, move muscles? And, of course, how did the whipping the boy got when he was a child produce this mental state called an anxiety? There are all sorts of unanswered questions, and those who bother with that deserve the puzzlement they get into. It's all absurd. The fact is that a person today gets into trouble in dealing with people because he was punished for dealing with people in a certain way when he was young. Now, it was stored in him all this time. And he can report that he feels anxious. Yes, feelings are byproducts. They're not causes of behavior. And once you recognize that, then trying to find out what's wrong with a person by having him search his feelings and to find inside what's going on, it's a misdirection. If you found out what causes the feelings, you'd be in a much better position.
Well, I've just recently been thumbing through a book entitled Anti-Democratic Trends in American Society, or some such thing, in which one of your articles that appeared in American Scholar the other year features very prominently, along with Edward Bernays' Engineering of Human Consent and so on. And you are labeled as one who denies free will and who is anti-democratic by tendency. Now, how say you to this charge?
Well, I deny free will if you mean that the inner man somehow or other can initiate action. What he does, he always does for some reason, and the thing is to find those reasons. I do not think that man is free, and I don't think that in a sense he deserves credit for what he does, because all of the things which have contributed to him should get the credit, if anybody should get the credit. So we have this problem about freedom and dignity and how they are to be handled at the present time. I'm writing a book on it, as a matter of fact, so I'm steamed up about it. But the point is that we, of course, do struggle to free ourselves from annoyances, from danger, and so on, and that's wonderful. And the literature of freedom, which has tried to free people from religious, governmental, and economic punitive methods and so on, is very much worthwhile. But then they say, well, that just shows you that all control of one person by another is wrong, you get into trouble, because we are all indebted to other people. And without a culture, we would be like those wild children that are raised by wolves or something. We would be feral in the sense of wild. We'd have no culture. We'd have no behavior worth speaking of at all. And so you can demonstrate that in their concern for the free inner man, the very people who are trying to help mankind are responsible for the fact that we still deal with human behavior primarily through punishment, and that when we try anything else, we only use weak forms. You see this with Freud and Rogers. They don't influence a person. They have a.
You mean they're abdicating a responsibility that you think
they're
they should?
ducking a responsibility. That's the non-directive point. You mustn't do anything that will hold you responsible in case things go wrong, because you must not take the responsibility away from the inner man, in the person that you're dealing with.
Isn't it possible, really, that a person like Rogers is rather emboldening the people he deals with, his patients or clients, to follow out certain implications that he himself has suggested and inferences that it's impossible for them to avoid? Or in other words, that they are directing after all?
No doubt, it seems to me, that anyone who is concerned for another person and talks to him, listens to him, makes suggestions and so on, he is influencing that person, and he can't avoid it. And you better just make sure that you know what you're doing when you do it that way. And I think that the great mistake that the non-directive therapist or the Socratic teacher makes is to suppose that really something does come from within. That's great scene in Plato, and Socrates tries to show that the slave boy knew Pythagoras' theorem for doubling the square all along. He says to the boy, "This is a square, isn't it?" The boy says, "Yes." We draw this now, and draws in two parts, "Isn't that right?" says the boy, "Yes," and so on. He goes all the way through the proof, and the boy says, "Yes, Socrates, yes, Socrates." And then Socrates has the gall to say, "You see, I told him nothing. He knew it."
Yes.
Well, he didn't know it. He couldn't have gone through the proof afterwards. Perfectly absurd. And yet that is used as a prototype of a lot of theories of teaching today, and therapy also. Someone recently commented on the fact that Freud was Socratic. He wanted to tease the solution out from inside. From my point of view, there is no solution inside, and if you get any result, it's because something else is coming into control.
Well, if one were just, for purposes of argument or discussion, to concede this point, wouldn't it be possible beyond this to argue that these myths are useful in and of themselves. That is, that man's belief in free will is a very useful device and has been through history? Or do you think
I think you can show it may have been useful in history, because remember, the earlier task was to rally the individual against his oppressors.
Mm-hmm.
And you do that by convincing him that he has power.
Yes.
That he is the person who consents to being governed and so on. And that's great. That's the way it should be. But then to go farther and to say that he is actually an originator, is actually an initiator, and that he has choice, rules out the possibility of going from this point on, where the problem is no longer to defend the individual against tyrants, but to make the individual productive.
Does this amount then to saying or suggesting that we've come to that point in history where it is not only desirable but necessary that we set aside the old myths and move quite self-consciously toward human engineering?
That I think is the point. And if you ask me whether I'm anti-democratic or not, all I'm saying is that the goals of democracy up to this point have been well worthwhile, and we have to some extent achieved them, although not too successfully. But that the very theories which we have used to reach those goals are now causing trouble, because they were not correct in the first place. They were useful, but they were not true.
Could you be a little more explicit about this? What goals, what postulates do you have in mind here?
Well, now you're beginning to ask, what would you do with the technology if you had it? This is the value judgment question. Is that what you
No, not quite that. You're suggesting that, in effect, democracy and all of the verbiage that goes with it has been useful up to now, or up until the recent past, but now has outlived its usefulness.
Well, you've already been mentioning an example. I really believe that we are on the threshold of a genuine science of human behavior, which, once we throw off these demon explanations in terms of traits and virtues and essences and occult qualities, and get back to the real causes of human behavior, that will flourish. Mm-hmm. And from it, we will have a technology which will permit us to solve our problems, and problems which are reaching the point where we are all scared to death, as you know. Now, if those who are the leading figures among liberals today, among the champions of democracy, are openly opposing the development of such a science on the ground that somehow it threatens human freedom and dignity, then I think they're causing trouble. And I think we've got to reconcile this very quickly, or we're lost. I think we've got to break free from an old-fashioned idea of freedom and dignity, and look instead at what those concepts were doing for us when they were working, and then see how we can carry on and further the basic goals of democracy in some other way.
Well, are the goals of democracy really worth furthering?
Well, they come from the very nature of man himself. It's characteristic of the human organism, as of any organism, to escape from or avoid punishment or aversive treatment and so on. And much of the literature of freedom has been designed to help people escape from those who are treating them in unpleasant ways. Now, that is certainly worthwhile, and will continue just because that's the way we're all made. We use human dignity or worth, we give people credit for their behavior in order to get them to achieve, to do things. Now, if it turns out that actually they're not responsible for their achievements, but that their history and their environment and their genetics is responsible, then it isn't quite correct to give them credit. So we have to say, well, we use this device say good for you and so on, when it isn't you, it's good at all. It's your background and history.
Your environment.
Your environment. But we say good for you to get someone to go on behaving in a way that we like.
So it's just a fraud.
Well, I wouldn't be that harsh about it, but I do think we have to recognize that that little device may have outlived its usefulness now, and that we ought to look at better ways of getting people to be achieving. You see this in programmed instruction, which is attacked quite widely, because somehow they didn't seem to recognize the creative aspects of the student. But if you want to learn a field very quickly, the thing to do is to get a good program and go through it, and you'll know the field like that. I mean, there's no question about that. But it doesn't fit the pattern, and those who are worried about human freedom and dignity are going to keep that from being used in our schools, and I could document that.
Well, you of course could document this better than anyone else. You are the founding father, the spiritual and actual father of the teaching machine, are you not?
Well, the programmed instruction, there were devices. Pressey had a testing device which could teach, but it did not present programs of instruction. What we call a teaching machine today is concerned with programmed materials, and I believe I did work out the first programs and techniques of programming.
I think one of the, certainly from a layman's and popular point of view, one of the things that's most intriguing about your career is or one of the most intriguing products of that career has been the Skinner baby box, so-called, the ideal environment. I'd like to have you speak a little about that.
Well, that's a curious, the history of that's it's interesting. I designed this thing. It's an enclosed crib space for a baby, air conditioned in the sense that the air is warmed and humidified, not cooled. You don't need that. The baby has a diaper on, but nothing else, and lies on a tightly woven plastic material. It feels like linen. It's very nice, and air breathes through it. It's a very safe environment. Child can move around and doesn't get waterlogged in wet blankets and clothing and so on. It develops very rapidly, good posture and that kind of thing. Easy to take care of, great labor-saving device for the mother and so on. Well, we used that on our second daughter, and she is now, I wish to emphasize, an artist studying art in London. There have been wild rumors about what happened to her, but she's quite a normal.
She's alive and well in London.
She's alive and living in London, and very fond of her, very bright and talented. But many babies have been raised in these now, hundreds of them. Matter of fact, I have a granddaughter in one right now.
How long do the infants stay in the baby box?
Well, they only use it for sleeping space. Use it as you use an ordinary crib, and that's into the second or third year, perhaps. It's a very comfortable. I wish I had one myself, actually.
What would you say, womb-like?
Well, I don't think that at all. That's a Freudian idea that you want to go back to the womb. You like comfort. And a baby is much more comfortable in an air crib than in an ordinary crib wrapped up in blankets and so on. Well, the reaction against that, of course, has been fantastic. I suppose it took 100 years to get over the idea that you had to be rocking a baby in a cradle all the time. So it'll take 100 years for this, too. But it will eventually, I'm sure, be the normal way of providing an environment for a small child, baby.
Well, given the kinds of reactions against some of your ideas, and this is not at all to deny the influence of your ideas and your products, do you really entertain great hope at this juncture in our society for the science of human behavior as you've described it?
Yes, I do. Many of my students get impatient. Oh, why don't these people see the light and so on? But I've watched this now for 40 years, actually, and I think I'm satisfied with progress. Certainly the laboratory research, the equipment which is now used, the precision of the conditions one can arrange the coverage of different species and so on. That's developing very rapidly. There's a flourishing journal, books published about it and so on. That's going very well. There's no question in my mind about the solidity of that as a corpus of scientific facts and principles and terms. As to the application, there has always been resistance to any substantial change. Right now, programmed instruction is very widely used in industry because industries are quick to catch on to something which is a more effective way of doing something. And they don't have to change the law or convince parents or school boards in order to change methods. Well, I'd like to see schools using programmed instruction more than they are doing. But they will do it eventually, and rather than sit around in a quiet rage about that, I'd rather get on to something else. It's too bad, but that children are being sacrificed for the sake of old theories. And the old theories are a very good example of what I've been talking about. This whole idea that you just want to be palsy-walsy with the students and let them develop their own natural curiosities and so on. That sounds awfully good in books, but it doesn't work out in practice.
Well, it does tend to destroy institutions.
And it's producing a lot of uneducated children today. There's no doubt about that. But that will come. Now, in the care of psychotics, you can take a ward in a psychotic hospital and work out some reinforcements, rewards, and give these people something to live for. They begin to develop a kind of order in their lives. Instead of being resentful of being pushed around and so on, they begin to take an interest in life. That's been done again and again now. However, it's still not widely used in state hospitals, but it's coming. It's been a matter of the first work on psychotics was done at the Metropolitan State Hospital here. Dr. Harry Solomon, a psychiatrist, and I set this laboratory up. That was in 1953 in Boston. And then Ogden Lindsley took that over. Well, that's 17 years. It's already working in state hospitals. And people in, let us say, in boards of mental health in states are beginning to look at this, and it will be eventually, or something which flows from it, will be eventually the way that the psychotic people will live when they have to be institutionalized. It's working for retardates. A big project is just starting out here at the Fernald School. And elsewhere, you can take the most refractory cases, as an autistic child, and make very rapid progress. And yet, these are all opposed. A law was passed in the state of Minnesota, I believe, making it illegal to reinforce psychotic people with rewards.
Well, of course, you're flying in the face of conventional wisdom here. As you know, I'm talking also with Philip Slater, and he is one of quite a number of social commentators, sociologists, critics of American society, who would insist that we have, in point of fact, come to the kind of engineered environment that you seem, at least, to be hinting at and pushing toward. And advertising is the key manipulator here.
Well, if I couldn't manipulate better than advertising, I wouldn't be here. I would not help advertising because I don't think it ought to be any more powerful than it is, but it doesn't do the right things. No, I would not want advertising to be taken as any kind of sample of a technology of behavior. But what else, where can you turn?
Well, beyond, still thinking in terms of the prospects for the science of human engineering, if this is the appropriate language, beyond a coterie, and in the population at large, this is certainly what it would be, a coterie of professionals, where do you find receptivity to this? That is, I'm looking at this society as one which has a political establishment, so-called, and all of the institutional structures where there's antipathy to some of your ideas. I'm looking at the so-called counterculture of the young. Certainly there's no great hospitality there. I'm looking at the liberals who are neither one thing nor the other, and lean one time this way and the other.
The young, there again, I question whether they are rejecting this. I know that there are young people who were bitterly opposed to Walden II as a manipulated society. On the other hand,
many of them didn't read the book, of course.
Well, but the sales of the book are going up fantastically. And from my mail, I know the young people are reading that book, and they are the people who are unhappy about the spontaneous communes, which satisfy some of the thing they're looking for, but are obviously not a permanent solution. You know, you go in and stay until the place is too dirty and move out, and that's not going to last. Nor are the communes which are held together by some sense of community or group marriage or something of that kind. Walden II is a pretty carefully thought out community designed to be a sort of super family to replace the shrunken family structure of American life, in which plans are made to keep the thing functioning. I think there's a great deal of freedom among the citizens of Walden II. I would live in one if there were one, I'm sure quite happily. Now, I believe that what has happened to that book is a sign that among young people today there's no counterculture. There is beginning to be a realization that you can't do what you want to do by trashing and by going off and having Woodstocks or temporary communes of a very obviously temporary nature. Now, I would say that a lot of young people today are beginning to see the need for a culture which they have designed themselves rather than had passed on to them. I think that is the essential feature of what's happening now. And that was the argument of Walden II. Now, this book has been around for 22 years. I'm not claiming that it produced, I wouldn't want to claim that it produced our present problems, but it does suggest that one ought to inquire into one's culture. Where does it come from? How do you justify it? Can't you do something better? And that's the heart of my book, and it seems to me to be essentially what these young people are saying today.
And yet they're always charged, these young people we're speaking of, with being anti-historical and wishing a kind of utopia, perhaps on an installment plan, but something that is, by definition, a rejection and negation of the past. And you seem to be implying something rather different here.
Well, that is different. The young people are talking about structure, and I really blame a great deal of this present trouble on the structuralism in anthropology, the Levi-Strauss kind of thing, the Gestalt idea that somehow or other you can learn something from the mere structure of behavior, which would be useful in doing something about it. Now, behavior has structure. You can study it. You can study kinship systems and whatnot, but you haven't explained anything when you've done this. And a young man who says, well, first of all, we must destroy the present structure. He can only say that if he believes that somehow or other another structure is going to spring spontaneously into existence. Yeah. And this is what people used to believe, that under anarchy people would naturally be good and so on. It's the Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the noble savage. Take civilization away, we're all happy without it, and so on. Well, that just doesn't work. And the idea that if you destroy what is here now, something better will naturally rise in its place is a great mistake, and I certainly don't share that with, if that's what the younger generation thinks, I don't share it with them. But I do feel that an attitude of scrutiny, inquiry into where cultural practices come from, what their effects are, and what can be done to change them, that's all to the good.
Why did you choose the fictional mode for this transmission of your ideas? I've always been interested in this. This is the one work of fiction so far, is it not?
Well, I wouldn't call it a novel. It's a platonic dialogue in a sense. No, the book was an accident. It was completely an accident. I was at a dinner party in the spring of the year of 1945. There was been a false armistice in Europe, and I remember it that way. And I was talking to a woman who had a son and a son-in-law in the South Pacific, and I said, "Now, isn't it too bad? The war's about over, and they're going to come back. They've been in this crusading spirit. They're going to come back and settle down again. They'll get a job, get married, rent an apartment, put down a payment on a car, and so on. Why don't they do something else?" And she said, "Well, what should they do?" So I began to say, well, why not do what they did in the 19th century? Start a new way of life. Go off by yourself. If you're a man of goodwill, try building a world of your own. And she kept drawing me out on this, and she said, "You've got to write that up." And I said, "Well, I can't do it because I've got a deadline, June 1st, another paper I promised to." She said, "Doesn't matter. Just write to the publisher and tell them you can't do that. You'd write this up." Well, I didn't take her seriously at all. I met the deadline on June 1st, and on that very day, I started writing Walden 2, and I meant it simply to be an exposition of what could be done. But I made some characters up to visit an actual community to report on this, and the characters just walked away with me. And I wrote it in 7 weeks. I've never written that fast. I usually write very slowly, in fact.
Yes, you're very laborious writer. Not that it reads laboriously, but
I have figured over, this has been true almost all my professional life, I spend about 2 minutes per word, per published word. I don't sit down and put one down every 2 minutes, but when I get all through with the writing and rewriting, the time I've spent, and I keep an accurate record, comes out to about that, but Walden 2 just dashed out. It was obviously, I think, well, not obviously, but someone has analyzed it as being a struggle between two sides of my own personality, and I think that's probably correct. My first name is Burris, and Burris, slightly misspelled, is the narrator, and Fraser probably is a blend of my middle name, Fred, and the man named Crozier, under whom I worked here, and many of whose mannerisms I can see in Fraser. And this, I was the dull Burris side of me trying to accept the flamboyant Fraser side of me, and eventually doing so.
Then this makes the work an intensely autobiographical one. And
it's pretty, well, of course, and it also reflects my idea of an ideal existence. Well, what it is 19th century English country life, except that there's no problem of laughter below stairs. Everyone is his own servant, you see, but you can still enjoy the amenities of that kind of life.
But you speak to a therapeutic kind of ingredient in this, an intuitive and creative
made a great deal of
act.
difference to me. That's the point about fiction. I don't think I deliberately chose it for this reason, but what I discovered was that it's marvelous to have characters who say things that you can't be held responsible for.
And yet, of course, you have been held responsible
Yes,
for...
I have. But I should
these.
accept the responsibility now. I would even.
Walden 2 is coming out again.
Well, it's out now in a hardcover edition. Yes, it's getting close to 1 million copies now. It's a very, very unusual history because the first 10 or 12 years, I don't think it sold 10,000 copies.
Well, of course, this is the history of a number of influential works.
The world has come around to it, not because of it. I understand. I don't think I had any influence in this, but the whole idea of why don't we really start it all over again and redesign a way of life. That is now very much part of the modern temper, and it was not when I wrote the book.
Let me ask, I hadn't intended to have such an extended discussion of Walden 2, and yet it is fascinating. And one thing that's always interested me is whether there is an intentional irony in the title, Walden 2.
Well, I was a great Thoreauvian. When the New York Times recently did an article about Walden 2, they asked if I would go out and have my photograph taken on the banks of Walden Pond, and I I jumped at the chance for thinking how it would enrage all the good liberals who were good Thoreauvians.
Of course.
But I used to go out, before the state took over and made that a park, I used to go out in the fall and pick up around the site of Thoreau's hut. I was very fond of Thoreau, and I carried a copy of Walden in the first car I ever owned to take the curse off owning a car, that kind of thing. And I think that there is very similar ideas. That build your own way of life, don't take one handed down to you. Solve the problem of having to be an eager beaver all your life by simplifying your needs and that kind of thing. Those are Thoreauvian ideas. I don't think there's any irony. There is a theme in the book which I pointed up a bit as I was writing it and realized it's coming out. Fraser is identified as a god. I think there are about 20 references to him as a god. There's a scene in which he takes the position of the crucifix. Everybody's offended by that.
Yes.
And then there is, Castle calls him a little tin god and so on. But there is definitely a theme there of whether God can be held responsible for the world he's created, and what would be the case of a person who designs a culture like a Walden 2. At the very end of the book, you may remember Burris can't make up his mind whether to join Walden 2 or not. And he struggles with this for a while, and then finally he comes back only to discover that Fraser knew all along he was coming back. But that's a shock. That you thought you were making a decision and someone knew all the time. This is the omniscient God, you know. Can man be free if God knows what he's going to do? Isn't he going to do what God knows he's going to do? You see, this is all... Margaret Mead, by the way, made a comment about that last scene. She's, as you know, a great, not a femme lib, but she's a very old champion of women.
Yes.
And I said to her one time, but look, I wrote Walden 2 to describe a world in which women were completely on a par with men. And that I did, actually. I had that strongly in mind. It was, I thought, a very great problem. And in the book, all men and women have the same professional positions and so on. Women get over their childbearing era very early and then are completely on a par with men. And Margaret wouldn't have this. She wasn't going to accept my doing anything for women. She said, and that's why you killed the book in the last scene. You killed the whole book in the last scene.
Yes, yes. Well, you see, you can't do for women what they must be like
I know,
to do
they
for
want to do it themselves.
Of course.
That's really, it's a curious thing, isn't it? It's impossible.
Well, I think this is the moral of those liberationist movements that we're confronted with in American society today. The black movement,
the black,
women's movement.
That's the tragedy of it. I hate to have the feeling that I am necessarily regarded as an outsider depriving blacks of their rights. And it makes it impossible to do the kinds of things you want to do.
Yes.
I worked in schools in Harlem and so on, and setting up better ways of teaching blacks, but I find that I'm being pushed. I may not be really being pushed, but I feel pushed out of it because I think they feel now it's something they must do for themselves. And it's tragic.
And yet, from a tactical and strategic point of view, it's absolutely necessary.
It may be. It may very well be. Yes.
If only transitionally.
Yes.
I wonder whether, as you've implied in talking of Walden 2 and its conclusion, you regard yourself as a religious person.
Well, no, I'm not religious. I was raised as a Presbyterian, and a lot of that creeps into my writing. The book I'm writing now has some rather interesting interpretations of some sentences from the Sermon on the Mount, for example. I'm very glad that I had the exposure to the Bible as religious literature, and I'm rather sorry that my children, who were not raised in any religion, have not had that literary experience. But I feel that the religion is another example of how something which has been valuable up to a given point is now causing trouble. I think the pie in the sky reasons for behaving well have been exposed. It's a fraud. We ought to have better reasons for behaving well toward each other. then that we will then go to heaven and not hell, and so on. And it's just as a child who feels that he's been mistreated when he discovers there's no Santa Claus, I think people tend to be anti-religious unnecessarily when they discover that they have been misled, and that when they die they're not going to collect. That bothers me. I think that I would prefer to have a humanistic religion, a true religion, I think, in that sense, in which heaven is on earth, and it's up to us to make it a better heaven than it is now.
And hell?
Well, we make our own hell on earth, too, and I'm all for escaping from it. I'm all for, I've always, in everything I've ever done, I've been quite clearly opposed to punishment. I was not punished by my parents, and I don't understand why I am so bitterly opposed to punitive methods, but I am. And much of my work has been designed to suggest something that can be used instead of punishment.
You talk of reinforcements and rewards.
Yes, well, yes, there are very powerful ways of manipulating human behavior, to use an ugly word, which do not have the unpleasant effects of threats of punishment.
Yes. Do you think of your work as a unity? It seems to me, and it's struck me a number of times in this conversation, that however disparate and varied and diversified your activities, running from highly scholarly works in professional journals to fiction or dialogue, and the clinical and all the rest of it, that the things that you've done really do add up to a kind of unified view of man and man's potentialities.
Well, I think they do. I don't see any great inconsistency. I've been writing books now for a period of, 32 years. And I go back and look at the first one I wrote, called The Behavior of Organisms, and there's very little I would change, very little I don't think is relevant to what I'm doing now. So it does seem to me that the thing is tying together. And as a matter of fact, what I'm doing currently is writing a book which will state what seem to me to be the implications of this for human affairs. And in a sense, that's tying up the strings.
This is
feeling my age. I'm pulling things together in a package, and I think it does make a package.
And this would be a philosophic statement.
Well, it is for the non-professional, the non-technical. It will be called Freedom and Dignity, which certainly sounds philosophical, but I analyze it from a behavioral point of view all the way along. I do go into the whole question of value judgments and the source of values, which I do not agree, as many physical scientists do, that science can only tell you how to do something and not what to do. Physics can tell you how to build a bomb, but not whether to. And if that were true of behavioral science, we'd be in a very pretty fix. But it isn't, because behavioral science is concerned with what to do.
So that, to come back to that much earlier question, you are a scientist, but you disavow the notion that the scientist need necessarily be immune to questions of values, ethics, and so on.
Oh, yes. I don't know who would have the special wisdom that scientists are not supposed to have in raising value questions. No, I think that the more we know about human behavior, the more likely we are to make successful solutions about problems in human affairs, and that's where I stand.
Thank you very much.